Welcome back to our study on the Olivet Discourse. And in the first episode, and if you missed it, watch that episode first because we're not going to go back into a lot of what we talked about in that one. But in that episode, we looked at the three versions in the Synoptic Gospels of the Olivet Discourse. When the disciples asked Jesus when what he just said was going to happen was going to happen. So in this episode, what we're going to do is look at an account of what actually happened within the generation that Jesus was talking to. And we're going to just compare this account to Jesus's words in the different versions of the Olivet Discourse. Before we jump in, if you haven't already subscribed, we would greatly appreciate it if you do that. And also liking, sharing, commenting, all those things really help us out. But let me say right up front, this video is going to be tough. There's going to be some shocking, I don't want to say imagery because I'm not going to show any imagery, but there's going to be some shocking words, some horrific descriptions of what happened, what actually happened in history. So it's important to know, and it's also important to see the visceral nature of it, if for no other reason than to help make sense of why Jesus was so adamant in the Olivet Discourse when he was talking to his disciples that they not be anywhere near what was going to happen. So just that trigger warning right up front. If you don't do well with vivid descriptions of horrific things, then you might want to just skim this video and get the gist of it. But let's look at Josephus's account of the fall of Jerusalem. Now, you can find this anywhere online. This is in the public domain. You can Google, you can read all of this. I'm going to give verse numbers, and we're going to be comparing it to Matthew's account of the Olivet Discourse. And we're just going to look at what Josephus describes as happening, and then we're going to look at Jesus's words in light of some of those things. Now, Josephus was originally, he was a Jewish rebel. He fought against the Romans. He switched sides after losing, and he became something of a bridge between Judaism and Greco-Roman culture. He wrote a lot. His Antiquities of the Jews is a massive, long history of the Jewish people. The Jewish War was his account of everything that kind of led up to and then came about from the Jewish revolts against Rome. He was not a Christian. He mentioned Jesus. There's a couple of brief points where he mentions Jesus. There's also an account where he seems to praise Jesus, and most Josephus scholars that I'm aware of almost unanimously say, no, that is a later addition by Christians that kind of snuck it in there to sort of baptize Josephus as one of their own. But to our knowledge, Josephus was not a follower of Jesus. If you're interested in more about Josephus, check out the article in the Dictionary of Early Judaism, the resource that we just reviewed here on the channel, since it is right now Judaism January. And there's a lot more about Josephus and his three major works that you can find in those entries. I definitely recommend it. So Josephus is describing all of the horror that surrounded the fall of Jerusalem. In 70 AD, Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans. The temple was burned to the ground. All of the people in the city were slaughtered. It was horrendous. And Josephus actually describes that in Book 6. Thus did the miseries of Jerusalem grow worse and worse every day. And the seditious were still more irritated by the calamities they were under, even while the famine preyed upon themselves after it had preyed upon the people. And indeed, the multitude of carcasses that lay in heaps one upon another was a horrible sight and produced a pestilential stench, which was a hindrance to those who would make sallies out of the city and fight the enemy. Now, when Jerusalem fell, before that, in the events leading up to it, the people from the countryside, as would happen in ancient warfare, flooded into the city, inside the big, thick, impenetrable walls of Jerusalem for safety. And so in Jerusalem, you had these different factions of rebels that were sort of vying for control of this rebellion. And then you had a ton of people just sheltering there for protection. And what happened is, as Rome laid siege to Jerusalem, the armies surrounded the city and just quarantined it, basically. Nothing gets in, nothing gets out. And as a result, the people inside eventually, because Jerusalem didn't have its own source of food and water inside the city, they would eventually starve to death. And that was the plan. That's how siege warfare worked. Siege warfare involved relatively little fighting and a lot of blockading so that the enemy starves to death or surrenders. So you would have these groups, these skirmishes and rebels that would go out and fight in and out of the city. But it says, the place was just utterly horrendous. Jerusalem during the siege of 70 AD was the last place you would want to be. And, this is part of why, look at Jesus, how he warns his followers of like, hey, this is going to happen. And it's not going to be a surprise when it starts. He says, learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see all these things, you know that it is near, right at the door. All these things meaning the things that Jesus had just described. See the last video for that. I tell you the truth, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth may pass away, but my words will never pass away. So Jesus was saying, this generation, the generation that you are in, he's talking to his disciples, generation roughly 40 years. Jesus gave the Olivet Discourse around 40 years late, within 40 years. 70 AD was before 40 years had passed. So Jesus was saying, this is going to happen. This city is going to be destroyed, and it's going to happen in this generation. So Josephus goes on talking about these that would go out to make sallies out of the city and fight the enemy. He says, but as they had their right hands already polluted with the murders of their own countrymen, and in that condition ran out to fight with foreigners, they seem to me to have cast a reproach upon God himself, as if he were too slow in punishing them. Now, Josephus is not sympathetic to the rebels in Jerusalem at all. And Josephus's account puts a lot of the blame for the outcome on this continued rebellion against Rome. Josephus could not be accused of Jerusalem patriotism, at least at this point. Even though he was writing on behalf of the Jewish people, he did not take a positive view of the rebellion that led to Jerusalem's destruction. And he talked about a lot of these people fighting for God, fighting for Jerusalem, fighting for the temple. They had murdered their own countrymen. There was so much infighting among the rebels, and the rebels looking to overthrow Rome at times would turn their wrath against anyone that they thought wasn't sufficiently loyal to their cause, or might be a Roman sympathizer. And so he says, he talks about there was a lot of murders of their own countrymen, that they would go out to fight the enemy after having murdered their own countrymen. And Josephus is just like, this brings a reproach upon God. Think of Jesus in Matthew, how he had said, at that time, many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hate each other. Jesus warned there would be a ton of infighting. Josephus goes on, and truly the very view itself of the country was a melancholy thing. For those places which were before adorned with trees and pleasant gardens were now become a desolate country all over, and its trees were all cut down. Nor could any foreigner that had formerly seen Judea and the most beautiful suburbs of the city, and now saw it as a desert, but lament and mourn sadly at so great a change. For the war had laid all the signs of beauty quite waste. Nor if anyone that had known the place before had come suddenly to it now, would he have known it again. Just this utter devastation, not just of the city, but the surrounding countryside around Jerusalem, which is in its natural state incredibly beautiful. People, the reputation Jerusalem had, and especially the Temple Mount, was incredible in the ancient world. Josephus writes about it elsewhere, just the awe that people had at the temple that Herod had spent years beautifying. And that's why the disciples were enamored by it when the discussion kicked off to begin with Jesus. Matthew 24, we saw Jesus left the temple, was walking away. His disciples came up to call his attention to its buildings. Do you see all these things? He asked. I tell you the truth, not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down. And that's exactly what happens to Jerusalem. Josephus goes on talking about the conditions within the city. This is verse 193 in book 6. Now of those who perished by famine in the city, the number was prodigious, and the miseries they underwent were unspeakable. For if so much as the shadow of any kind of food did anywhere appear, a war was commenced immediately, and the dearest friends started fighting one another about it, snatching from each other the most miserable supports of life. Nor would men believe that those who were dying had no food, but the robbers would search them when they were expiring, lest anyone should have concealed food in their bosoms and counterfeited dying. The famine was so bad that the robbers, and I believe I'd need to double check. I think this is the word lestes in Greek that Josephus is writing in. I think. Don't hold me to that because I haven't. This is just on the fly. But if that is, this is the term for the two that were crucified on either side of Jesus. They were lestes. And when Jesus condemned the temple, my Father's house will be a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of lestes, thieves. I think this is the term that's used. I know Josephus uses that term. I can't remember if this is the spot or not. But regardless, this is what he's talking about. People in the city, the famine was so severe that they became paranoid and they turned on each other, which is exactly the point of a siege anyway. Rome would just sit outside with their hands folded and wait for the people to take each other out. But they would, search bodies that were dead because they thought, oh, maybe they're just pretending to be dead, but really they're hiding food. Just unspeakable famine. It continues, nay, these robbers gaped for want and ran about stumbling and staggering along like mad dogs and reeling against the doors of the houses like drunken men. They would also, in the great distress they were in, rush into the very same houses 2 or 3 times in one and the same day. Moreover, their hunger was so intolerable that it obliged them to chew everything, while they gathered such things as the most sordid animals would not touch, and endured to eat them. Nor did they at length abstain from belts and shoes, and the very leather which belonged to their shields they pulled off and gnawed. The very wisps of old hay became food to some, and some gathered up fibers and sold a very small weight of them for 4 Attic drachmas. Just utter starvation to the point where you will eat anything to make the hunger pains abate. That's what famine does. So the chewing of leather, pulling the leather off of a shield. What is leather? Leather's animal skin. And so the idea is, well, you can eat animals, and even old hay is a type of vegetation. Horses eat it. So in desperate times, the people get desperate and they eat things that, he says, not even the animals would eat. So just horrible, horrible conditions, to the point where people were rising up and fighting against one another. If food was even hinted at, friends would start fighting with one another about it. And so you think about Jesus' warning. Now you will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it you're not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of birth pangs. In and around this time, there were earthquakes throughout the Mediterranean world, and the famine that Josephus is talking about in this passage. Jesus said, there's going to be famines. When nations rise against nation and kingdoms against kingdom, there are sieges, and with sieges will come famines. So that's not in and of itself like some supernatural prophecy, but the idea of infighting and war, nation against nation, famines, like Jesus was warning his generation. And this is the part where if you're squeamish, skip ahead in the video. Josephus says, but why do I describe the shameless impudence that the famine brought on men in their eating inanimate things? Well, I'm going to relate a matter of fact, the like to which no history relates, either among the Greeks or the barbarians. It's horrible to speak of it and incredible when heard. Look at this hyperbole. No history relates what I'm about to tell you, whether among the Greeks or even among the barbarians. It's like Josephus is saying, what I'm about to tell you is worse than anything that's happened from the beginning of time and anything that will happen afterwards. Here's what he says. There was a certain woman that dwelt beyond the Jordan. Her name was Mary. She was with them, besieged therein at this time. So she had lived across the Jordan during this time of war. She had come, like many others, seeking safety in the city. What food she had contrived to save had been also carried off by the rapacious guards, who came every day running into her house for that purpose. If she found any food, she perceived her labors were for others and not for herself. And it was now impossible for her to find any more food, while the famine pierced through her very bowels and marrow. She then attempted a most unnatural thing. So this woman he's going to talk about, Mary, from somewhere outside the city. The rebels would come in every day, ransacking her place, searching for food. So she is completely famished, and any food that she does come across is taken from her by force. So look what she does. Snatching up her son, who was a child sucking at her breast, her infant child, she said, "O you miserable infant, for whom shall I preserve you in this war, this famine, and this sedition? As to the war with the Romans, if they preserve our lives, we must be slaves. This famine will also kill us. Even before that, slavery comes upon us. Yet are these seditious rogues more terrible than both of the other? Come on, be my food and be a fury to these seditious rebels. As soon as she said this, she slew her son and then roasted him and eat one half of him and kept the other half by her concealed. This was done in her mind, perhaps to spare the child, but also she says to be a fury to these rebels. She's going to do it in a way that's going to bring shame on them. So, verse 209, upon this, the rebels came in presently, and smelling the horrid scent of this food, they threatened her that they would cut her throat immediately if she did not show them what food she had gotten ready. She replied that she had saved a very fine portion of it for them, and with this uncovered what was left of her son. Hereupon they were seized with a horror and amazement of mind, and stood astonished at the sight. When she said to them, "This is my own son, and what has been done was my own doing. Come, eat of this food, for I have eaten of it myself." Cannibalism of a mother to her infant child because of what the rebels had done and the pitiful state that the city had been reduced to. After which those men went out trembling, being never so much affrighted at anything as they were at this. With some difficulty, they left the rest of that meat to the mother, her cooked child, upon which the whole city was full of this horrid action immediately. And while everybody laid his miserable case before their own eyes, they trembled as if this unheard of action had been by themselves. So those that were thus distressed by the famine were very desirous to die. And those already dead were esteemed happy because they had not lived long enough either to hear or see such miseries. So it succeeded in what Mary from across the Jordan wanted to happen, which is to bring reproach against the people that had put her in that condition, but at such a horrid price. So now with this story in mind, think about Jesus's words, how dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will not take place in winter on the Sabbath, for then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. How much does that sound like Josephus talking about, I'm going to tell you something the like to which no history relates either among the Greeks or the barbarians. You see vividly the kind of misery that Jesus was warning his disciples to get out of and have nothing to do with. Get as far away as you can from Jerusalem when you see these things start to happen, because it's going to be unequaled distress. Then Rome, after all of this, eventually sets fire to the temple and it burns down. Josephus tries to kind of massage the events a little bit with like the Roman general didn't really want to do it, but like some soldier somewhere accidentally set something on fire and then it caught and blazed through the city. You know, Josephus, you never can tell exactly how truthful he's being on things when it comes to painting Rome in a negative light, because after all, he was a patron of Rome at this point. But the temple starts to burn. Josephus says, this is verse 271, while the holy house was on fire, everything was plundered that came to hand, and 10,000 of those who were caught were slain. Nor was there a pity of any age or reverence of gravity, but children and old men and common persons and priests were all slain in the same manner, so that this war went around all sorts of men and brought them to destruction. And as well those who made supplication for their lives as those who defended themselves by fighting. So no one was spared, whether you were a little child or an old peasant, whether you had participated in the rebellion or not, slaughtered. And the temple was plundered. You know, this had happened before in Israel's history. The temple had been defamed. It had been made desolate and through abomination. And, you know, Jesus says, so when you see standing in the holy place, the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. That's a callback to the events that Daniel was describing that happened in the temple, and Antiochus Epiphanes coming and, there being war against a foreign oppressive regime. And just like in those days where the Maccabean rebels fled out to the wilderness to kind of regroup and, sort of form their revolt to then come back and overthrow. Similarly, Jesus tells his followers, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. And so the temple is burning, it's looted, people are being killed. Josephus goes on, the flame was also carried a long way and made an echo together with the groans of those who were slain. And because this hill was high, and the works at the temple were very large, one would have thought the whole city had been on fire. Nor can one imagine anything either greater or more terrible than this noise. So the noise of the roaring flames mixed with the screams of the dying people. For the ground did nowhere appear visible for the dead bodies that lay on it. But soldiers went over the heaps of those bodies as they ran upon such as fled from them. Just bodies everywhere, carcasses everywhere. And who is overseeing all of this destruction? The Roman soldiers running over heaps of bodies. And what standard did the Roman soldiers fly? What was the symbol of Roman might? The eagle. The military standard of Rome was the eagle. And in Greek, the word eagle and the word vulture, same word. Think about Jesus saying, wherever there's a carcass, there the vultures or eagles will gather. And during this time, false prophets and false messiahs arose. Josephus says, a false prophet was the occasion of these people's destruction, who had made a public proclamation in the city that very day that God commanded them to get upon the temple and that there they should receive miraculous signs of their deliverance. This prophet, whoever it was, God will save us. Get to the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. You know, they had said that back in Jeremiah's day, and God was like, you think I'm going to spare a temple, a human building that's been completely desecrated, that my presence is gone from? Well, these zealous first century rebels clearly had not gotten the message of the Hebrew Bible, and they were depending on miraculous deliverance by God to smite the enemies. Now there was then a great number of false prophets bribed by the tyrants to impose on the people who were announced this to them, that they should wait for deliverance from God. And this was in order to keep them from deserting, and that they might be buoyed above fear and care by such hopes. Like, keep the people focused on God's going to save us. God's going to save us, so they don't flee, so they don't run away. But Jesus has told his followers like 30 something years before this happens, when you see this start to happen, when you see, just like when you see the beginning of a fig tree budding, get out. Exactly the opposite message of what the false prophets and the rebel leaders were telling the people. Thus were the miserable people persuaded by these deceivers, and such as belied God himself, while they did not attend nor give credit to the signs that were so evident, and did so plainly foretell their future desolation, but like men infatuated without regard, either eyes to see or minds to consider, did not regard the denunciations that God made to them. Josephus is like, the signs were there. Everyone could have seen this, and they just paid no heed to it. Look what Jesus had said earlier. Watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, claiming I am the Messiah, and will deceive many, and many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. That's exactly what Josephus said happened. At that time, if anyone says to you, look, here's the Messiah, or there he is, do not believe it. For false messiahs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and miracles to deceive even the elect, these deceivers. If that were possible, see, I've told you ahead of time. When Jerusalem fell, to our knowledge, there weren't a lot of Jesus' followers there, if any. What were some of these signs that Josephus said were evident, that were telling God's people, I have abandoned this city and this temple, and it is going to fall? Like, what Josephus seems to say that was plain to anyone with eyes to see and ears to hear. Well, he gives an example. Thus there was a star resembling a sword which stood over the city, and a comet that continued a whole year. So a celestial heavenly sign. Thus also before the Jews' rebellion and before those commotions which preceded the war, on the 8th day of the month of Nisan, at the 9th hour of the night, so great a light shone upon the altar in the holy house that it appeared to be bright daytime, which lasted for a half hour. This light seemed to be a good sign to the unskillful, but was so interpreted by the sacred scribes as to portend those events that followed immediately upon it. So these publicly declared that the signal predicted the desolation that was coming upon them. Josephus is claiming, now whether this actually happened or not, that's going to depend on how much stock you put in Josephus's account. But he is recounting that there were all kinds of cosmic signs and supernatural signs that told about the desolation that was about to happen, but that people had either ignored or considered those as good omens, like, oh, God's shining his light on the heavenly temple, that means it will never be destroyed. Whereas the sacred scribes, according to Josephus, said, no, this is God's wrath is shining down, or something like that. I don't know exactly how they interpret it, but they interpret it as, no, this is not a good sign. And then he gives another one. Besides these, a few days after that feast, on the 21st day of the month of Iyar, a certain prodigious and incredible phenomenon appeared. I suppose the account of it would seem to be a fable were it not related by those who saw it, and were not the events that followed it of so considerable a nature as to deserve such signals. For before sunset, chariots and troops of soldiers in their armor were seen running about among the clouds and surrounding the cities. Josephus is saying, look, this sounds crazy, but a lot of people claim to have seen, or he's at least making the claim that a lot of people claim to have seen, in the skies, these armies up in the clouds surrounding the city, like a heavenly portent of what is about to happen on earth. And this, you can't help but think of Jesus' words when he's talking to his disciples and says, "For as lightning comes from the east, is visible even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken." Those are Old Testament passages. We'll look at those in a future video. "At that time, the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and all the nations of the earth will mourn. They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory." Now, am I saying that that Josephus describes, this army in the clouds surrounding the city, is what Jesus was talking about? No, I'm not making that tight of a connection. What I'm saying is Jesus warns his followers that it is not going to be unnoticeable when the Son of Man comes in glory. Now, what the Son of Man coming means, again, we'll have to wait for another video to look at that. But if Jesus is talking about the coming of the Son of Man and linking that to the destruction of Jerusalem, which seems to be the context of the entire Olivet Discourse, then what Josephus is describing would make sense of the type of things Jesus saying are going to happen when all of this goes down. And there's even more. Josephus says, "Moreover, at that feast which we call Pentecost, as the priests were going by night into the inner court of the temple, as was their custom, to perform their sacred ministrations, they said," in the first place, they felt a quaking. Think back to Jesus talking about not just the famine, but earthquakes in various places. "They felt a quaking and heard a great noise. And after that, they heard a sound as of a great multitude saying, 'We are departing from here.'" Old Testament readers would think back to Ezekiel and the visions Ezekiel had of God's presence, his chariot throne, leaving the temple, and that being a portent of Babylon being able to then come in and destroy the temple. This is absolutely a callback to that motif. Josephus says that happened in 70 AD as well, that the priests themselves heard a voice saying, "We are departing from here." God's presence leaving the temple. And then one more thing happened that Josephus tells us is worth noting. "But what is still more terrible, there was one, Jesus, son of Ananus, a common man and a husbandman." Now, this is not obviously Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus was a common name. Yeshua, Joshua, Yehoshua. It was just a common name. Tons of Jesuses. Even in the New Testament, there are a lot of Jesuses, Yeshuas. So this Yeshua, ben Ananus, son of Ananus, just a common man, regular family man, says 4 years before the war began, and at a time when the city was in very great peace and prosperity, came to that feast wherein it's our custom for everyone to make tabernacles to God in the temple. So the Festival of Tabernacles, Sukkot. This regular Jesus comes and says, verse 301, "began to suddenly cry aloud, a voice from the east, a voice from the west, a voice from the four winds, a voice against Jerusalem and the holy house, a voice against the bridegroom and the bride, and a voice against this whole people." This was his cry as he went about by day and by night in all the lanes of the city. You know, this brings to mind what Jesus said about the coming of the Son of Man. "He will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other." So again, not saying that this is the fulfillment of this, but rather this gives us some of the imagery, some of the language that's used from the east, from the west, the four winds. It's just a language of totality from everywhere. And so Jesus talking about, his elect gathered from the four winds, that's his elect gathered from wherever they are. And so what did this Jesus, son of Ananus, go on to do? Well, he wasn't popular. Josephus says, however, certain of the most eminent among the populace, and this is, again, at a time of great prosperity that this happened, and he goes around and says, a voice from the east, a voice from the west, a voice against this whole city and this temple. Now, Jesus had been crucified in part for saying he was going to destroy the temple. or at least that's what his enemies assumed that he had claimed. So speaking against the temple was a big no-no in first century Jerusalem. And so now another Jesus comes along about 40 years later doing the same thing and says, certain of the most eminent among the populace had great indignation at this dire cry of his, and took up the man and gave him a great number of severe stripes. They whipped him. Yet he did not either say anything for himself or anything peculiar to those who chastised him, but still went on with the same words which he cried before. Hereupon our rulers, supposing as the case proved to be that this was a sort of divine fury in the man, brought him to the Roman procurator, where he was whipped till his bones were laid bare. That sounds familiar. Yet he did not make any supplication for himself, nor shed any tears, but turning his voice to the most lamentable tone possible, at every stroke of the whip, his answer was, "Woe, woe to Jerusalem." Another Jesus had also said, "Woe to Jerusalem," in the exact chapter right before this entire discussion takes place. Fascinating parallel. I'm not saying that one is a fulfillment. I'm not even saying that this Jesus, son of Ananus, was a follower of Jesus of Nazareth. I had no reason to suspect that he was, but the parallels are just fascinating, especially in terms of how he's treated. And Jesus said to his followers, by the way, then you will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death, and you'll be hated by all nations because of me. The Jewish leaders and influential people that were against Jesus, and the Romans who ultimately had Jesus put to death, those collaborating together. And Jesus is telling his followers back in the Olivet Discourse, hey, this is the kind of thing that's going to happen, because people don't like when you speak against their sacred cows. And the ethno-political identity of Jerusalem had become a sacred cow to the people of the first century. So whipping couldn't stop this Jesus from continuing to declare woe to Jerusalem. Now, during all the time that passed before the war began, this man did not go near any one of the citizens, nor was he seen by them while he said so, but he every day uttered these lamentable words as if it were his premeditated vow. Woe, woe to Jerusalem. Every day, this guy Jesus going around saying, woe to Jerusalem. Nor did he give ill words to any of those who beat him every day. So he didn't speak against the people who were beating him, nor good words to those who gave him food. The ones who probably felt pity on him or maybe started to kind of believe him, would give him some food. He didn't say anything to them either. But this was his reply to all men, and indeed no other than a melancholy presage of what was to come. This cry of his was the loudest at the festivals, and he continued this dirge for 7 years and 5 months. So 4 years before the war, and then the 3 years of the war. But every festival, this guy would show up. Talk about somebody being a wet blanket. Like, they're trying to celebrate the festivals, and this guy's like, woe, woe to this city. God is against this. It's just like, that's not what you want to hear at a patriotic celebration. But he continued it 7 years and 5 months without growing hoarse or being tired therewith, until the very time that he saw his presage in earnest fulfilled in our siege, when it ceased. And he didn't stop on his own accord. Josephus tells us this is how he stopped. For as he was going around upon the wall, he cried out with his utmost force. So Jerusalem's besieged by the Romans. This guy, Jesus, son of Ananus, is going around the wall, and he's saying, woe, woe to the city again, and to the people, and to the holy house. And just as he added at the last, woe, woe to myself also. So this Jesus, son of Ananus, included in those woes himself, because he was part of the city. He was part of the people. Just as he said, and woe also to myself, there came a stone out of one of the engines, the siege engines, a catapult, and smote him and killed him immediately. And as he was uttering the very same presages, he gave up the ghost. So he literally died with woe to Jerusalem and woe even to myself on his lips. So then flash forward, the siege, Rome has come in, the temple's burned, everything. This is verse 404 of book 6. He says, but when the Roman soldiers went in numbers into the lanes of the city with their swords drawn, they slew those whom they overtook without mercy, and set fire to the houses where the Jews were fled, and burnt every soul in them, and laid waste a great many of the rest. And you think back what Jesus had said, this just makes me think about his words warning about all this. Jesus had told them, let no one on the roof of his house go down to take anything out of his house. Let no one in the field go back to get his cloak. Like, when this starts, When you see the eagles gathered, get out, because nothing is going to be spared. And Josephus is confirming that. And so the soldiers, when they would come to the house to plunder them, they found in them entire families of dead men, and the upper rooms full of dead corpses, that is, of such as died by the famine. They then stood in horror at this sight and went out without touching anything. But although they had this pity for such as were killed in that manner, yet they had not the same for those who were still alive. But they ran everyone through whom they met with, and obstructed the very lanes with their dead bodies, and made the whole city run down with blood, to such a degree indeed that the fire of many of the houses was quenched with these men's blood. So this was the fate of Jerusalem, according to Josephus, that everyone in the city was put to death. They either died of famine or they were killed by Rome. So at least looking at this, now we can see why Jesus was so adamant that his followers flee Jerusalem. In the Olivet Discourse, you can see why he wanted all of his followers to not be anywhere near what was going to happen. Why did Jesus weep over the city? Was it just because they rejected him? I mean, that was part of it, but no. It was because he knew that by their rejecting him and by their putting their faith in their own military might, their own power, and the idea that God will protect Jerusalem just because God has to protect Jerusalem. Those who bless you, I'll bless. Those who curse you, I'll curse. You touch Jerusalem, you touch the apple of God's eye. Like all these promises, and you hear them today, Christian Zionists trot them out all the time. That's what people were believing in the first century. And they were depending on the fact that God will not let his city fall. And these evil pagans that surround us with their armies, God will do what he did in so many Old Testament incidences of driving them out. Just like in Hezekiah's day, he'll push them away somehow, just like he did with the Assyrian threat. Well, he didn't do that. He didn't do it when the Babylonians came. He didn't do it when Antiochus came. And he didn't do it when the Romans came. And that's what Jesus, in a line of prophetic woe oracles stretching all the way back to the Old Testament, was telling his people. And the Gospels, all three of the synoptics, record a variation of this discourse that Jesus gives, this prophetic warning of what was about to happen. And Jesus makes it clear, before this generation passes away, what I'm telling you will have happened. And Josephus shows us that that's exactly what did happen. In fact, some more liberal or skeptical scholars say that Jesus, like the Olivet Discourse, some New Testament scholars, especially in the 19th and 20th century, they'd say, well, this wasn't original to the Gospels. This is there was some type of apocalyptic writing that was written after the fall of Jerusalem and then retrojected back into the mouth of Jesus to make Jesus appear like, a great prophet. Or the Son of God was the ultimate prophet, one like Moses, who Deuteronomy 18 had said what God would raise up, and that he actually was doing what a long line of persecuted Jewish prophets had done, which was declare woe to the city of Jerusalem for rejecting what God was calling them to do. In the days of, say, Jeremiah, it was turn back to the covenant. In the days of Messiah, it's embrace me, the Messiah. But they didn't, because Jesus didn't look like what a Messiah was supposed to look like. He didn't look like someone that was going to come in and kick out the Romans. He wasn't a strong military leader. Jesus didn't look presidential, as we would say today. And he knew that those religious leaders and the people whose identity was tied to Jerusalem and the temple were going to see him as a threat, because he was democratizing the concept of Jerusalem and the temple. He was centering it on himself. The temple is my body. Tear this temple down. In 3 days, I'll rebuild it. He was centering the idea of Israel on himself. He gathers his 12 followers and sends them out as his emissaries to regather the lost sheep of the house of Israel and also to bring in Gentiles. And he desacralizes the geography of the covenant. The Samaritan woman says, hey, our people worship on this mountain, but your people say we got to worship in Jerusalem. And Jesus says, yeah, but there's a time coming when true worshipers of God aren't going to worship on any mountain. They're going to worship in spirit and in truth. Well, if your identity is based around geography, that message is not going to be popular. Even today, there's some followers of Jesus who still put a huge degree of emphasis on geography instead of the worldwide kingdom of God. So Jesus' words have never made people comfortable. And the Olivet Discourse, because he is tying in so many threads from not just the Hebrew Bible, but also the events of the intertestamental period, and then looking forward to what's going to happen in 70 AD. And he sort of presents it all in this one discourse. And what does that mean then for, okay, did all of this all happen? Like, is the Olivet Discourse entirely talking about 70 AD? Well, some Christian scholars say yes. They say that a preterist approach to the Olivet Discourse is the correct way to read the passage. Others say no, the disciples asked two questions. When will these things happen? Destruction of the temple. And when will be your coming? And so Jesus answers both. He talks about the destruction of the temple, and that's the bulk of what he's talking about. But then he does jump forward to the final day of the Lord and the final coming of the Son of Man. So the coming of the Son of Man in context refers to the Son of Man being vindicated, his prophecy of the destruction of Jerusalem coming true, sadly, and his followers being spread out into the world with the message of the gospel, and it, spreading and continuing to spread until eventually he'll, come and tie it back up. And so they say, no, a partial preterist approach is what we should take. Yes, he was talking about the events of 70 AD. You can't read Josephus and not come away with that, but he wasn't limiting his words to 70 AD because they also would have a future and an even greater fulfillment. And then you have some more traditional, either Christians or skeptics, and they just say, oh, Jesus was predicting the end of the world because he couldn't imagine the destruction of the temple without it being the end of the world. And so he gave that prediction. And if you're a skeptic, you'd say, and he was wrong. And this is how we can see it. So I think Albert Schweitzer and others popularized, Jesus just got it wrong. And if you're a believer who holds that view, you'd say, no, Jesus didn't go wrong. There's something that stopped the clock and put this long period of time in place. And then something is going to restart the clock in the future. And that's when then the things that Jesus is talking about will start happening again. The prophetic clock will start ticking once more. And so you see that in a lot of, dispensational approaches or futurist approaches, where really the events of 70 AD, Jesus doesn't even have that in mind. He's talking about the end of the world. So these are different ways that people have come to the Olivet Discourse. In the next video, we're going to start looking at some of those in more detail, look at some of the arguments from people that hold the different views, because the goal, at least my goal in making this video series, is not for you as a viewer to come to one particular conclusion on the Olivet Discourse. Like I have my general kind of where I land. There's some things I hold with loose hands about the Olivet Discourse, but I generally land, somewhere in here on that spectrum. But if you end up not, that's okay. The goal of this series is for you to at least have the background, both biblical and extra biblical, to be able to read Jesus's words and hear them in what you think is the most likely way that the original readers, the original audience would have understood them. That's the goal of all good Bible interpretation. So stay tuned. That'll do it for now. We covered a lot in this video, but here at Disciple Dojo, we're not a TikTok channel. We don't do a lot of shorts or reels. I think those are terrible ways to get your theology, honestly. And so we do long form. Our videos are unapologetically long form. So if you're one of the people that like to leave those comments that I get from time to time, get on with it. You're taking too long. 5 minutes in and you haven't even got to the point. Those always crack me up. And I always respond you will probably be better suited for TikTok. We don't do that here. We do long form biblical teaching and discussion. And it's because we want to train disciples, people who meticulously interact with the text, who study it, who pore over it, who don't just accept what some popular talking head on TV, on radio, in a book, on a blog, here on YouTube, including me. We don't want people who just take what other people say and adopt it as their own view. We want to create people who search the scriptures and who listen to various points of views and who calmly weigh things instead of knee-jerk dismissing them. So hopefully this series and the other stuff that we have here on the channel, our other playlists, lend themselves to that outcome. That's my hope as the person who runs this channel. That's what any good sensei wants his students to do, is to be able to learn the moves for themselves, to get the techniques, that they become their own techniques and they're not just repeating patterns that they've been taught. You know, that's the martial arts metaphor. That's what we want here for people biblically. When it comes to biblical exegesis, theology, interaction with culture, all of that. That's what we're about here at Disciple Dojo. So if you appreciate that, we would love for you to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And we honestly would love if you would consider becoming a monthly dojo donor. We're a 501c3 nonprofit. We rely, the bulk of our budget comes from our monthly donors, not from YouTube. So if you value this ministry, a great way to show it is to go to the link. I'll put it here on the screen below and become a monthly dojo donor. Any amount. I don't see who gives what. We keep me away from the finances. That's handled by our board and our finance director. But if you do become a monthly dojo donor, whatever amount you're able to give, let me know. Use the contact form on the website to send me a message. And I would love to send you one of our Disciple Dojo patches. Had some of these made up for our dojo donors as just a simple thank you, a little tangible something to send you. So shoot me a message through the contact form and just say, hey, I'd like a patch, either the dark or the light color one, and I'll get one to you in the mail. And just know that you're helping this ministry do what we do, and we could not do it without you. But that'll do it for now. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for more on the Olivet Discourse. In the meantime, as always, keep training.